Hey, it's 11:02, so we will get started. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar from CNL's decommissioning team for the Chalk River Laboratories. My name is Mike Giardini. I'm a communications officer for stakeholder relations at CNL. So before we get started, I would like to say CRL is located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As an organization, CNL recognizes and appreciates their connection to this place. CNL also recognizes the contributions that First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made, both in shaping and strengthening this community in particular, and this province and country as a whole. We'll be talking about today the decommissioning process of CNL's legacy facilities at Chalk River. We'll start with a presentation, and then we'll open up the floor for a Q&A discussion period. Before that, I'll go over a few housekeeping details before I introduce Kaylee Greener. There is a simultaneous interpretation of this discussion. You can access the session in French and English through the globe icon on the bottom right of the bar on Zoom. Select the language you would like to hear, and please note there is a slight lag in the translation, so please wait for the full translation to come through before speaking. Today's session is planned for about 1 hour. We anticipate the presentation will take about 20 to 30 minutes, and the rest of the time will be a discussion. Please use the Q&A icon to submit your questions at any point during the presentation, and we'll respond to all the questions following the presentation. The Q&A icons are also found at the bottom of the screen. Note, we will be recording these sessions and posting them on our YouTube channel afterwards. And if you're having any issues or would like to chat further outside this technical discussion, please get in touch with us at ermstakeholder@cnl.ca. Rachel Chenette and Margot Thompson on our team will be watching the inbox, so we'll try to get you sorted out. Okay, so now I'll introduce our panelists. Presenting today is Kaylee Greener, who is the Director of the Facilities Decommissioning and Environmental Remediation Branch at Chalk River Laboratories and has worked for CNL since 2015. Supporting Kaylee today are Patrick Akins and Chris Lariviere, who are managers with FD&ER. Patrick has worked for CNL since 2014, and Chris has worked for CNL since 2007. Okay, one last thing before we start, we are going to do some polls. So Rachel, if you could get the polls open. So we'd like to know before how familiar you are with Chalk River Laboratories. You're either very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar. So if you can vote for that. Okay, so 65% are very familiar. 0% are not familiar, so that's great. So this will help us kind of guide the presentation. 35% somewhat familiar. Okay. Question 2. How familiar are you with the decommissioning process and projects at Chalk River Laboratories? Lots have been going on since 2015, and Kaylee's group has been a big part of it. So let's give it a moment. Okay, so we have 33% very familiar, 56% somewhat familiar, and 11% not familiar. So thank you for taking part in these polls. This will help kind of help us describe the work they're doing throughout the slides. So that's great. Okay, so without further ado, I will hand it off to Kaylee Greener. Kaylee?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending the webinar that we're hosting this morning on the decommissioning and demolition process at Chalk River Laboratories. So the presentation I'm about to run you through is a fairly high level, but still comprehensive presentation on what the D&D process is at Chalk River and what we've done over the last 6 years since the GoCo government-owned contractor-operated model has come into place at CNL. And then following up with the questions, myself, Chris, and Pat will be happy to go into more details with any of you if you have further questions or wish to have more detail on some of the higher level items that I touch on today in this presentation. So to start, we're going to go through the cleanup function, which is the overarching program that links land use, the D&D program, and the environmental remediation program together for the whole of Chalk River. We'll briefly touch on what Chalk River Laboratories is, although it's good to see most of you all of you actually are familiar with Chalk River. We'll go through what the decommissioning process is for Chalk River. We have a short video here lined up, and that's what we took to mark our 100th building demolition since GoCo came in 2015. And that took place last year in the summer of 2021. And then we have some statistics to share with you just to help demonstrate the progress that we've made over the last 6 years in terms of measurable items like buildings removed, footprint reduction, waste moved, all in the effort of reducing the liability on the site and taking waste and putting it in a more controlled environment than it is today in some of these legacy facilities. And then, as I mentioned, we'll move on to the question period. Next slide, please. So the cleanup program, or the cleanup function, is the overarching function for CNL, but largely for the Chalk River Lab site that links a cradle-to-grave process on how we manage our facilities and our lands on the Chalk River site. So the first component of this is the land use program, which guides what we're going to do with the land at the end of the day. It requires significant engagements and robust planning so we understand what we're working towards. If we want the land to be suitable for interim waste storage, if we want it to be a site of a new build facility, or if we wanted to return it to forested land. The land use program is what pulls in all the factors that we need to consider. So from the start, we know where we're going. So we don't do some work and then 5 years later, 10 years later, or beyond, need to readdress some of the conditions on site. And that leads into the decommissioning and demolition program, which takes the output from the land use program and ensures that we build that into our planning from the start. So we know what we're doing with the buildings that we're decommissioning and the end state that we want to get to. That then links into the environmental remediation program, which is all the below grade areas of the Chalk River site. And again, that takes what's left from the decommissioning and demolition program, which could be soil, or it could be contaminated foundation that we're leaving in place for further work in the environmental remediation phase. That comes into play here in the environmental remediation program, where we then restore the land to whatever the next land use could be. And again, that could include an in situ waste disposal area. It could include interim waste storage. It could be a site for a new build facility, or again, turning back to forested lands like the majority of the Chalk River site is. Next slide, please. Really high overview here, because again, all of you are familiar with Canadian Nuclear Labs. So Chalk River is the main campus of CNL. It's in the Ottawa Valley, and we have areas spread throughout the country, up in the Northwest Territories, the Whiteshell Labs in Manitoba, a few prototype reactors off-site in Quebec and Southern Ontario, and then the Port Hope Area Initiative. And the important thing to note here is that we all talk together. So decommissioning and environmental remediation efforts that are take place at the Whiteshell site, or at the offsite reactors in Douglas Point or G1 or Port Hope. We're all learning and developing these programs together. So we're sharing lessons across our programs. So we're not doing this work in isolation or siloed. Next slide, please. Again, the Chalk River Labs has been a pioneering nuclear research campus really for the world. Outside the USA, we had first sustained nuclear criticality Significant research has been done on the Chalk River site, and perhaps most notably, decades worth of isotope production to support medical treatments. Now, some of this started in the 1940s and is still ongoing today. But I think we all recognize that standards that were in place in the early days of the Chalk River site are not what they are today. And that's an important item to consider when we do our decommissioning planning for some of the legacy facilities. Recent past is very well documented, and the standards of managing radioactive wastes or managing labs that do various radiological research is very well documented and done to a high level of rigor. But if we go back half a century ago or more, at the time, it was done to what the current standards were, but by no means would it meet acceptable standards of today. So the result of all of this pioneering research and good medical efforts that took place on the Chalk River site is some pretty old facilities that have a variety of contamination and other hazards throughout that we need to deal with now as part of the decommissioning and demolition program. Next slide, please. So important to note here, we've done significant work since really the early 2000s for some amount of decommissioning work, but we really picked up this effort once GoCo came into play in 2015. So our early efforts, when we decided that we were going to increase funding and increase effort in the decommissioning portfolio on the Chalk River site, we had to start from somewhere. So 2015, the facilities decommissioning team was about 50 permanent employees strong. And now, including some of the supporting SMEs or subject matter experts that we have embedded in our team, we're near the 500 people mark. So it's a significant amount of people working on the decommissioning and environmental remediation efforts on the Chalk River site. We started with easy facilities from 2015 and working progressively harder. We needed this time to establish our teams, learn new technologies, implement them in the field, train staff, so we'd be prepared to deal with the higher hazards and some of the more significantly contaminated facilities on site. And we've been progressing through that effort. Now we've essentially worked through the vast majority of the low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better term. And we now have most of our effort focused on some facilities with some of the more significant hazards on the Chalk River site. Next slide, please. Two key objectives. These are very high level, but they are key objectives of our program, and that's to manage and reduce the risks at the Chalk River site. So that's not just risks to employees, that's risks to the business, that's risks to the environment. As I mentioned earlier on, many of the facilities on the Chalk River site are fairly old, some being constructed as early as the mid-1940s. And with that comes technology of the time. The facilities contain quite a bit of materials that at the time were perfectly fine for constructing, asbestos being a key one, that are now part of our efforts to manage the risks in these facilities. And asbestos is just one example, but the facilities are old, and it does take effort to manage that and reduce the liability to the site. And while we're doing our work to manage and reduce those risks, we also need to maintain our facilities in a safe and compliant state. So our facilities for the entirety of the decommissioning process are under license from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and we must maintain our facilities to their regulations while we're doing our work. So those are the two key objectives for our team, is to maintain our facilities and progress the decommissioning scope. Next slide, please. So now as part of the decommissioning scope, we have three phases, and I think the next slide touches on this a little further. But we have key areas where we need to focus our efforts. One is storage with surveillance, and that, as I mentioned, is the safe operation and maintenance of the facilities from the day that they are turned over to us and cease operations. So that could be coming from a science and technology mission or a site operations effort. The facility is shut down and turned over to us. We then need to maintain it in a storage with surveillance state as we build out our decommissioning plans. And while we're doing the work until that facility no longer exists, there's significant upfront planning and stakeholder engagement on the site to ensure we're mitigating the appropriate risks and ensuring we have the appropriate support from the various site programs. And then finally, we actually do the decommissioning and demolition work. And through all of this, it goes without saying, but our priority is, the safety and the liability reduction to the Chalk River site. Next slide, please. So in a little more detail here, so for phase 1, which is bringing the facility into a safe, sustainable shutdown state, a lot of work goes into doing that, and we've had some pretty good lessons learned from some of our previous facilities. On the easier facilities that were shut down and turned over to us, it was simple as documenting the current state of the building, and then we would sign over ownership from a site operations group into facilities decommissioning. But in some of the higher hazard buildings that have more significant lab operations, there is a lot of work that goes into bringing a facility to a safe shutdown state. And again, we've had some facilities where we've missed some good opportunities to do more work while the facility was operational as part of bringing it to a safe shutdown state to make it in a more ideal condition for our work. And we're going to take those learnings and build on that going forward. We have quite a number of significant facilities that are due to be turned over in the next decade. And it's really important that we get into those buildings early and work with the current building occupants just to fully understand what makes sense from a safety and efficiency point of view to do while the building's in an operational state, and have it configured such that it supports safe and efficient decommissioning efforts. Once the building is shut down, it transfers over to facilities decommissioning. And at that time, we have a document called Storage with Surveillance Plan that goes through the CNSC for approvals. And this document describes how we need to maintain this facility in a safe and compliant manner. So all of the required maintenance, the required checks, required upgrades that may need to take place in the building, either to support the safe operation of the building or to support future decommissioning work, would all take place in this period. And this also allows us time to do more in-depth planning on what the actual decommissioning and demolition plan is going to be for a facility. So for some examples, we've had facilities in a storage with surveillance state for over a decade before we transition into phase 3. And for others, phase 2 and 3 happen concurrently. We move it into a storage with surveillance state while at the same time begin initiation of decommissioning work. And then phase 3 is the final decommissioning and demolition work. It's certainly the longest, most effort-intensive period of the 3-step process. And this would be where we perform all of our decommissioning activities, which are described in a little more detail in the following slide, that we need to undertake to remove systems from buildings, to perform remediation, remove hazards, which would both be radiological and conventional hazards, isolate from all of the site services, which would be, for example, steam and power, air, and then ultimately transition to the final step of that, which is the facility demolition. And in some of our buildings, it takes years and years of effort in storage with surveillance and decommissioning activities before we're actually ready to do the demolition work. That's certainly the activity that gets the most attention. It's the most visible activity, but that can only happen after intensive efforts by our team inside the facilities to ensure we have the facility and the hazards remediated and prepared for final demolition. Next slide, please. So in order for us to safely perform our decommissioning, we developed preliminary and detailed decommissioning plans. For the legacy facilities on the site, we've established some preliminary decommissioning plans well after the facilities were constructed. This was not a requirement in the 1940s and 50s. And that's essentially the document that outlays the strategy with how we think we will eventually go to decommissioning of a facility. On a positive note here, with the new builds taking place at the Chalk River site, we are engaged early in the process. So the preliminary decommissioning plan is prepared as part of the initial design elements and initial licensing of new facilities to move into the construction phase. And this is really good because it allows us time to give input in the facility design. So the design of the facility can factor in decommissioning items that might not otherwise have been factored in. And a key item to that is accessibility. A lot of the legacy facilities just don't have the accessibility for people or equipment to get into certain process areas of a building. But if we can have the facility designed from the outset to provide appropriate access points, appropriate shielding, components installed in such a manner that they're not embedded in the facility structure, so we could safely remove them in the future. That's a great opportunity for us to get that as part of a building design. Once we're ready to move into actual decommissioning, then we now have to prepare a detailed decommissioning plan. This is the document that that the CNSC authorizes, that moves us from storage with surveillance state into a decommissioning license. So in this plan, we would present our overarching strategy and work planning efforts on how we intend to decommission a facility. In here, we would have cost estimates, we would have waste estimates, we would have dose estimates from a radiological perspective, and the strategy that we would follow in the phasing of how we are going to decommission a building. This would then go to the CNSC for comment and approval, and we work with them to address any gaps or outstanding areas that we need to provide a little more information. And ultimately, we do get the approval for the DDP, which allows us to move into the field and start the decommissioning efforts. So again, in that document, we develop our decommissioning strategies on how we're approaching the decommissioning efforts. There's significant regulatory engagement to understand what we're going to do with our waste, what we're estimating for waste forecasts, the effort that we always undertake to reduce as much as possible the radiological waste, so we can recycle or clear as much as we can. And then we have to maintain information from a liability perspective. So the site facilities are all existing with a certain amount of liability cost assigned to them. And as we progress our plans, we need to update that to better reflect what the true liability is of some of these facilities, and a more accurate measure of the efforts that are going to be undertaken to perform the decommissioning. And then we do research and develop and test new technologies. So I'll talk a little bit more on that on the next slide, but we do invest significantly in developing technologies and work methods that tries to remove the worker from the work front, to reduce hazard to our staff, to allow us to more safely perform the work that we're undertaking. Next slide, please. All right, so when we do get into to the physical decommissioning, as I said, there's a lot of effort that goes in here before we get to the demolition, the final demolition of a facility. Initially, we do extensive scoping campaigns, and this focuses on both radiological and conventional hazards, so we understand what we're getting into. So that can include asbestos, PCBs, mercury, lead, obviously radiological contaminants. And it's a key activity to undertake because it's not always visible what may be contaminating or what may be below the surface in a building. Over decades of facility operation, many labs will have underwent renovations, which may have resulted in new floors or new walls. And oftentimes they're just put over top of the existing floors or walls for ease of installation. And other times it's intentionally done as a means to provide shielding from perhaps a spilled contaminated substance on a floor. So when we do the scoping campaigns, it's to understand what we're getting into. So we look at floors, walls, process systems to set a baseline for what we're going to have to manage and deal with. Then that transforms into large-scale characterization, which is far more intrusive, far more samples, far more analysis. And the characterization takes that initial scoping data and fills the gaps to allow us to actually safely do work planning. So this would be the information that helps us understand how exactly we undertake the work, how much work we need to do in terms of remediation and removals, and where the waste stream is for this particular item. If it's clearable, if it can be recyclable, if it needs to be low level or hazardous waste, the characterization efforts help drive our work planning and our waste disposition. We also isolate and terminate building services. Again, for some smaller, simpler buildings, it's as easy as isolating an electrical feed to the entire building. And then we now have electrical isolation in place and we can safely perform our work. In some of our more larger facilities, though, we do have to go on a room by room manner. There are some challenges with this as a result of legacy configuration in our facilities. Again, 70 years old. Many of our labs and buildings have undergone various renovations. so we do bring services back room by room, ultimately leading to a building that is fully isolated and ready for decommissioning. In many of the facilities that are turned over to us, there's quite a bit of material that can be reused. So we work closely with our asset management teams at the Chalk River site to really declare surplus as many items as we can, so they don't become waste for Chalk River and they can be reused somewhere else. And when that's not possible, then that moves into the next step, which is removing the systems from a building. So in this case, again, if it was a large scale lab, there'd be many systems that would have to be removed. There could be fume hoods, glove boxes, process piping, ventilation systems, all of which would have to be removed from the facility due to contamination levels. Or if it's a simpler building, there may not be much that has to be removed from the building. It may be all clean waste that we can disposition as clearable. But all of that work takes, for some of the larger facilities, years to progress till we're at the point where we have a building that we need to do final remediation on, which could be wall shaving or concrete scabbling to reduce the activity and the materials present. And then we move into the final building demolition. Again, the final building demolition is the very visible highlight activity of the successful completion of a decommissioning project, but it takes significant work that's really not seen by many people inside the facilities to ensure that they're ready to be safely decommissioned and demolished. Next slide, please. All right, and this is a short video that we had prepared last year from our 100th building demo. I guess Mike or Antoinette, that's on you to play. All right, thanks for the video. And just to give a bit of perspective on that, that building was the former process water and cooling water supply for the NRX reactor. And when that reactor was shut down, a portion of it transitioned to be an emergency cooling backup supply for the NRU standby diesel generators. So this building was in service since the late 1940s. And the video that you saw there was essentially a time lapse of less than 2 months of field work from a demolition perspective. But there was over 2 years of time inside that facility performing characterization, large scale asbestos abatement. There were amounts of concrete remediation that needed to take place that was contaminated from various activities in this facility over the last 6 decades. And so again, 2 full years of effort leading into that final 2 months of demolition. Next slide, please. Okay, and this would be the last slide, I believe, before we move into the question period. So just to highlight our efforts, since we really accelerated the decommissioning scope on the Chalk River site. Again, starting in 2015, we were a team of about 50 individuals. We've developed and grown to be about 500 now. In the 7 years since GoCo came into effect, we've safely decommissioned and demolished 111 buildings, 280,000 square foot from a footprint reduction perspective. We've been able to divert and recycle, either through a cycle or going to a clean landfill offsite, 20 million kilograms of waste. From an asbestos perspective, over 185,000 kilograms of asbestos we've removed from our facilities and have sent to offsite asbestos landfills. From a hazardous waste perspective, and this could be lead, mercury, PCBs, 34,000 kilograms. The big item here from a low-level waste perspective is almost 3 million kilograms of low-level waste. So this waste we've compliantly and safely stored in containers in a licensed waste management area. And ultimately, this waste would be destined for the proposed near surface disposal facility if that's approved. And then we've generated about 44,000 kilograms of intermediate level waste. And this can be resins from rod bay filtration systems that would have had exposure to fuel at some point in time in operation. This could be tritiated waste, amongst a few other options. And we've not generated any high level waste over the course of our decommissioning activities, which is good, because if we did come across any high level waste in our facilities, that would certainly have been a very unexpected condition. Next slide, please. Okay, so that concludes the presentation that we had prepared for you today. So now we can move into the question period.
Okay, thank you, Kaylee. There's a lot to kind of take in there for people that are that were somewhat familiar with the work going on or not familiar. That's a lot of information, because it's a lot of great work and a lot of work that's gone on. So we will go into the question and answer period. So we'll let people kind of wrap their minds around what they just heard. And but we do have a couple coming in here. So we'll get right into it. How will CNL guarantee only low-level waste will go into the projected NSDF project from facilities decommissioning?
All right, good question, and I'll answer this on the perspective of the waste that facilities decommissioning generates. So as mentioned in the presentation, we do significant scoping campaigns to understand what is in a facility before we really get into it. And then that moves into significant characterization. And the characterization process is a rolling wave effort. It doesn't start and stop at any point in time in the decommissioning process. It's ongoing from the day we start the work until the day that the last bin is packaged and shipped to a waste management area. And through that process, not only are we doing upfront characterization of the waste as it's generated from the removal activities, and then verification steps once it's packaged in a bin. So from those 3 areas, we gather significant amounts of data so we fully understand what the contamination is and what the waste streams are that we're generating. so that's how, from a facilities decommissioning perspective, we absolutely know what waste we're generating. And then the waste data from the characterization perspective is stored in a database administered by our waste programs team. And that data is held in perpetuity, to be accessible at any time to cross-reference and check to understand what we've packaged in our bins.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, have there been any unexpected finds such as asbestos or contamination during these projects?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the facilities are old. Some of them have been around for more than 70 years. So it's not always apparent what kind of contamination or items such as asbestos that we might uncover as we start to remove systems and walls and structures and really piping systems and tanks. So we often do find unexpected discoveries. But we do administer our work with a very robust process called integrated work control. And that brings in not only the teams in the field, it brings in everybody who may have input or a part of executing a work plan. So that could be our trade staff, carpenters, utility workers, electricians, RP surveyors, health physicists, supervisors, waste characterization specialists, industrial hygiene technicians. So we develop our work plan, we go into the field, and as we're executing, when we do come across unexpected finds of contamination or asbestos, the work is paused, the team safely backs out, we bring back together the group of staff who developed that work plan, and we regroup, we try to understand what we've just encountered, what we need to know more about it, we may need to execute additional characterization, we may need to have additional engineering, a wider range of mitigating actions can take place, but ultimately that team that participated in the integrated work control package for this scope would redevelop that and implement a change to that plan before we went back in to deal with the unexpected discovery that we found in that process.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, have you been able to implement any lessons learned through experience? Have you been able to reduce volumes of waste, radiological exposures, and how long does it take?
I can take that one. So with respect to lessons learned, so Kaylee had mentioned earlier on in the slideshow and throughout really, and summarized it with the last slide. So we've successfully removed 111 facilities to date. In 2015, a lot of those facilities started with the lower rad hazard type facilities. So we had some equipment storage facilities, we had some sheds that we started with to really tackle the low hanging fruit, for example, and that gave us an opportunity to allow our equipment operators the opportunity to learn how to safely demolish buildings. It also gave our field staff the opportunity to simulate different environments from both a rad hazard as well as the different industrial hazards. And really what that resulted in is the opportunity through these last 6 to 7 years and experience of removing 111 facilities is to slowly and methodically increase the level of hazard by which we're doing our decommissioning work and implementing the lessons learned from each and every building. Each building is looked at as its own project, which has a lessons learned component at the closeout phase. And those lessons learned are documented and applied for each of our future buildings and projects.
Great, thanks, Chris. Okay, a few more. We'll keep going on here. Okay, what are the opportunities for contractors not currently on the large or small valued MSA agreements for proposal submittal and participation?
I can take that one, Mike, if that's all right. So thanks for the question there, James. As we kind of alluded to during this presentation, the bulk work that we do in facilities decommissioning is self-performed. And again, that's through a robust training program, through developing the skills of our own workforce here on site. That does lead to different opportunities as well with some of the other scopes of work that we have in our portfolio for to be accessed through the supply chain. So specifically, I can't answer that question, but Mike, that might be one that we take offline with procurement and supply chain about how people can showcase what kind of scope that they could deliver for CNL, and that's that interaction would happen through the supply chain and procurement.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, so James, if you do want more information on that, please give us an email. Send us an email, ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and we'll get you more information. Okay, next one. You stated that some of the demolition waste is destined for the proposed NSDF. How is the waste being safely stored currently, seeing as the disposal facility has not yet been approved / constructed?
I can take that one. So that's a great question, and Kaylee touched on it very briefly. So that any of our waste that has been characterized as low-level waste that ultimately would be destined for NSDF is safely packaged in ISO containers and then stored out at our licensed waste management areas where they undergo rigorous surveillance and monitoring to ensure the robustness of the packaging and that the waste is safe to be stored in the given environment until such time it can be placed in the proposed NSDF if and when approved.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Next question. We still have some time here. It's great that CNL sites are communicating together on lessons learned from decommissioning at each site. Beyond that, are you working to gain wider industry or even international experience on decommissioning and demolition practices or new technologies?
Right. So the short answer to that is yes. So we do regularly have benchmarking sessions. The last few years, it's been largely virtual, but we have been interacting with some of our colleagues in the UK and the US to understand how they're tackling some of the similar challenges that we have here on our site. And that can be related to a wide variety of things, tanks with products in them, glove boxes, fume hoods, how we do isolations on facilities. There's a wide range of topics that we talk about on these discussions, recognizing that both the US and the UK are under different regulatory environments than we are in Canada. Not to say it's better or worse, it's just different. You can't take one practice at one site and directly apply it here, but there's certainly things that we can share and learn from one another to ensure that we're not reinventing the wheel or worst case realizing an event to take place that we didn't have to because someone else had already figured that out. So again, we do a fair bit of virtual sessions with colleagues from various locations in different countries. And with COVID lessening, I'm hopeful that we can start getting some of our staff boots on the ground in some other areas to help understand and learn from what others have experienced already.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kaylee. So that seems to be the end of the questions coming in. So we'll take this opportunity to do some closing polls to help us kind of understand how we did. Okay, so polls should be popped up on your screen. After this webinar, how would you rate your understanding of the decommissioning process at Chalk River Laboratories? Okay, so we have 53% have come in at excellent. and 37% good. So that's great. Believe that means it was a very thorough presentation, Kaylee. That's great, and good Q&A session. Okay, last one. Would you be interested in future webinars about some of the decommissioning projects at Chalk River Laboratories? Just a few more moments here. Okay, so 94% say yes. So we'll take that back and discuss it offline on what we should do a webinar on next. No, that's great. It's great information going forward. We do actually have a fifth question. Fifth and final question. All right, would you be interested in future webinars about the decommissioning process at other CNL sites? Okay, it's a few more moments. %, again say yes. Okay, so that's great. Thank you for your feedback. We always enjoy getting feedback from the public. So that will end the webinar. So I'd like to thank Kaylee, Patrick, and Chris for taking the time to do this presentation. It's great to do a webinar on this topic. It's not always with all the projects that we have going on out in the public. It's great to talk about the great work that Facilities Decommissioning is doing at Chalk River. So Kaylee, do you want to do any closing statements or anything?
No, thanks everyone for your participation in this session, and I recognize this was a pretty high level overview, so we'd certainly be happy to talk a little more detailed on some of our major decommissioning projects to expand upon the high level process that we talked about today and how we actually apply it with good examples in some of our specific jobs.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Kaylee. Thanks, Patrick and Chris. And remember, if you have any other questions and you didn't get to them, you could always email us at ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Okay, so that will end the webinar. Thanks for joining, everybody.